Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I have to tell you all that this is my first lecture in person since the pandemic. So it feels slightly more anxiety-making than they always are, because it's so, it's wonderful to be back in a room with actual people, as opposed to be on those wretched screens, sometimes looking at faces and sometimes looking at just black holes that you don't know who they are. So I'm very, very happy to see you, and thank you for the invitation. So I do feel part of a long connection with Sussex, so it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. And as I arrived here and looked at the transformations which this campus and this university have gone through, it's pretty striking. But anyway, it's good to be here. So my title tonight is Entangled Histories, Britain and Jamaica in Slavery Days and Beyond. And I realized actually that it should have been, for which I apologize, it should have been England and Jamaica in Slavery Days and Beyond, because actually my material tonight is all drawn from England and Jamaica. It might not have been, but it is. So the talk tonight is in the context of Black History Month, established as a time to give some attention to the presence of Black lives in Britain. It's been a turbulent year, as we all know, with the murder of George Floyd and the toppling of Edward Colston's statue in Bristol, the debates that have followed about why the history we remember matters. Much of this has centered on public sites and memorials. So, for example, the rage from some quarters over the National Trust's report on the numbers of their properties, the 90 properties they have with connections to slavery and empire, and the attempts currently by the Restore Trust, who are challenging the so-called wokeness of the National Trust staff. Not the volunteers, actually, it's the staff, I think they're after. The pushback against rethinking histories has a long history itself, but it's re-emerged in a vigorous way. And it draws on what Stuart Hall called the defensive embattlement of those who think that questioning statues or questioning history is an attempt to erase history, rather than accepting that histories are always contested, always being rewritten, and that there is no single true history, that public statues are frequently removed in the context of political changes. We're now living in a very contradictory moment. On the one hand, there is much official recognition of diversity. Think of the celebration of the diversity of the current Tory cabinet, while at the very same time, Priti Patel, herself the child of immigrants, deports Black British citizens on the grounds that they have no right to be here. We have official denials of institutional racism and racial inequalities, and at the very same time, the pursuit of policies which entrench them. These issues in the present have long histories, and indeed the past lives on in the present in all of us in our different ways, changing our habits, shaping our habits, and informing our relations to other people. So there's a need to think historically. We know how extraordinarily popular family history is, the search for origins, for roots, for a place to belong in this time when the scale of mobility globally has meant so many people have left histories behind in their search for work, for survival, for the hope of a better life. And especially perhaps at this time, the search for family histories, when the future is so uncertain and the planet so endangered. We need to attempt, however, to get beyond toxic arguments or simple constructions of empire as good and bad, and try and think of ways of talking across these divides, on the basis, in part, of historical work. Looking at the history of the United Kingdom as one that involves many peoples, waves of migration much complexity, and a range of debates on questions of race, gender, and class. In Black History Month, we can think particularly about the need to excavate Black histories. This can be a very difficult task. The silences, the painstaking archival recovery work, which is necessary. Sorry, I thought for one ghastly moment I'd missed a page, but I haven't. Reading archives that were never designed to tell us about Black lives, the fragmentary finds, searching across national and imperial boundaries, for those lives have often been very mobile, the patterns of both coerced and voluntary migration in search of work and livelihoods. The materials can be very painful to find, the violence of slavery, colonialism, and its aftermaths, or in the present, the multiple reports we have had of the treatment of the so-called Windrush generations, their sufferings in the face of government mistreatment, the loss of homes, work, and family. The ongoing Windrush Scandal is a reflection of a long-standing crisis over who belongs and with what rights in this society. And Black people have responded to the patterns of exclusion by making claims, initially as Black subjects of the Crown, and now as British citizens. Much of the work of recovering Black histories has been done by individuals and community groups. And as we know all too well, the numbers of Black historians in universities is pitiable, as is the number of Black undergraduates and postgraduates studying history, a reflection of how they do not learn of their own histories and their own selves at school. At the same time, there is much work to be done in tracing the ways in which English and British identities have come to be identified with whiteness, how we ourselves have been racialized as well as white, named as white. We need to grasp the long history of English and British encounters with others, especially but not exclusively imperial others, who have been defined as lesser and can be excluded from full national belonging. So I'm going to talk today about two moments in the long history of entanglement between England and Jamaica and how these were understood in England, trying to address both constructions of white Englishness across connections to the history of empire and the recovery of Black histories. So my two moments are the moment of conquest and the establishment of the plantation system based on the enslavement of captive Africans. And here I'm going to tell you a family story, a white story. And my second moment is 1834 and after, the moment of emancipation and after. How are Black British subjects thought about at that time, and what's the connection between that and conceptions of English identities? And I want to draw attention this evening to the ways in which arguments over racial difference have been part of British society since the early days of colonialism. Well, my first moment then. The entanglement between England, and it was England at that time, and Jamaica began in 1655. The Civil War of the 1640s ended with the execution of Charles I in 1649. You're going to get a quick history lesson here, for those of you who don't remember what was going on in the 17th century, which I'm sure there are quite a few of you who don't. So after the execution of Charles I, Oliver Cromwell established the Protectorate, and then he had to secure power in Scotland and Ireland, as well as dealing with internal enemies, radicals such as the Levellers and Diggers. When that work was done, Scotland defeated, Ireland brutalized and colonized anew, he turned his attention to the Spanish, the traditional Catholic enemy of England, and developed a plan to challenge Spanish dominance of the West by attacking their American empire. The Western design was the expedition, and it was very much supported by London merchants who were keen to develop commerce as well as hoping for access to the famed gold and silver of Spanish America. There was much press and pamphlet coverage of all of this, so ideas about the Caribbean were entering metropolitan life, and that wasn't for the first time, as we know from Shakespeare's The Tempest, for example. Cromwell's plan was ill-conceived and badly executed. The English army and navy failed spectacularly in their aim of taking Hispaniola, but managed to regroup and land in Jamaica, which had been colonized by the Spanish, but much less well defended. This was the first time the English state had initiated a colonial venture. Jamaica is a small island, but it was well positioned geographically in the Caribbean Sea, not far from Cuba and Hispaniola, and with favorable trade winds. A long struggle ensued between the Spanish colonists, supported by enslaved Africans who were loyal to them, and the English army. The original inhabitants, the Taino, had been subjected to genocide by the Spanish over 30 years, with a combination of hard labor and the new diseases they were subject to. So in Jamaica, the only access to a time before colonialism is through archaeology. By the time of the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the Spanish had effectively been driven out. A governor was appointed and a House of Assembly established with representation for propertied white male colonists who were promised the rights of freeborn Englishmen. One of the first acts of the new assembly was to pass a set of slave laws, copied from those which had been established in Barbados, an island already functioning as a successful sugar colony. The laws demarcated between the treatment of indentured white servants and the enslaved. It was clear that already the colonists believed that their future lay with sugar and slavery. One of those on the original expedition was Samuel Long, a young man from Wiltshire. He had no capital, but as an officer, he had access to land, for both Oliver Cromwell and Charles II were enthusiastic about the idea of a commercial colony which would bring revenue and increase global power. They wanted settlement. Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York, were keen promoters of the slave trade and of the Royal African Company. Samuel Long was soon able to set himself up on an estate that had been worked by the Spanish, producing sugar, indigo, and ginger. He turned to sugar and rapidly became what they described as a red-hot planter. Over the next years, he bought more land and enslaved people. At the same time, he was asserting his rights as a freeborn Englishman, including the right to make new laws appropriate for the colony. This was particularly relevant for the slave code. Slavery was not legal in England, though the slave trade was. By the time of his death in 1683, Samuel Long was a wealthy man, the owner of 2 plantations named Longville and Lucky Valley, both in the parish of Clarendon, one of the most fertile parts of the island. It was within easy reach of the capital Spanish town, the center of colonial power, and of a harbor from which the sugar and rum could be shipped to the English consumers who were delighting in the sweetness it added to their coffee and chocolate, the new tropical pleasures. And here we have a contemporary map of the island of Jamaica. You can see very clearly where Spanish Town and Kingston are. And then a map from 1804 that we've made very heavy use of on our database. And Clarendon is in the middle of the island. And here we have the situation of the 2 plantations, Lucky Valley and Longville, with an outline of the parish of Clarendon. Samuel Long's inventory at his death recorded the source of his wealth in land and people. the ownership of 140 enslaved men, 148 women, 50 boys, and 49 girls. His total estate value was over £7,000, and he owned over 11,000 acres. 60 chairs and 7 tables graced the hall of his splendid house in Spanish Town. The bulk of his estate was left to his only surviving son, Charles, who was 4 at the time. His bequest to his loving wife, Elizabeth, included the use of the townhouse and all his household stuff for her lifetime, an annual income of £250, and 10 cows and calves, such as she shall choose, and 10 Negroes, and 40 ewes, and 6 mares, all such as she shall choose, with pasturage for the said cattle, and their increase during her life. His daughter Elizabeth was to receive £2,000 at her marriage, or when she reached 18, and 2 Negro girls and 20 cows, and their increase. The bulk of the property was left to the son, ensuring the continuity of the line. The widow was given money and a lifetime's interest in the house, and the daughter money at her marriage. Aged 12, she was to become the owner of 2 girls, probably of a similar age to herself. The widow and daughter were also granted the increase, as it's called in the will, of their female human property, along with that of their cattle. Samuel Long was appropriating the future reproductive lives of the enslaved women he owned by claiming their children as his property. The slave owners rewrote European patterns of inheritance, which passed through the male line, by defining a biologically driven, perpetual racial slavery through the female line. In the 1650s, slave owners in Barbados started to use the term increaser to identify female slaves of childbearing years, and they linked the reproductive lives of women to those of their agricultural commodities. The term increase was used for both animals and women, as Samuel Long did in his will. Owners could leave their own children prospects of future wealth. Childbirth then, as the feminist historian, African-American historian Jennifer Morgan insists, needs to stand beside the more ubiquitously evoked scene of violence and brutality at the end of a slave owner's lash or branding iron. Slave owners could accumulate capital, for enslaved people were a particular form of capital, human capital, animate capital, through their ownership of childbearing women. The enslaved people were the most valuable asset of a plantation. Samuel Long succeeded in founding a dynasty. His son's marriage to the daughter of another slave owner, William Beeston, who was also a slave trader and merchant, resulted in the development of 3 branches of the family. One focused on the plantations in Jamaica, one on the mercantile business in sugar and rum, which was based in London, and a third which owned property in Jamaica, but were wealthy enough to live as landed gentry in Suffolk. For 6 generations, wealth was transmitted from Jamaica to England, and this went along with careful choices of marriage partners and the organization of inheritance through the oldest son, all of which secured the accumulation of capital and the purchase of land. By the time of emancipation in 1834, the plantations and the West India trade were in effect supporting about 50 members of the Long family living in England off the fruits of enslaved labor and the sugar they produced. £20 million was paid to slave owners at the time of emancipation in order to secure their support for abolition, to get it through Parliament. This was the last time that enslaved people were assigned a monetary value, at least in the Caribbean, Mauritius and the Cape. The detail of the amounts paid to slave owners clarify who benefited in the extended Long family. Oh, that's another one of Lucky Valley and Longville, which shows what we do with our maps on our website and how you can click on the white dots and get details of the ownership of those estates. So this is the Long family members who benefited directly from compensation. And this is our homepage, in case there are people here who've never had a look at it and would like to. But it was not only wealth that was transmitted from one island to the other over generations. It was also the practices of racialization, how men and women were defined as black or white, free or unfree, through specific forms of economic organization, legal codes, political rights, and spatial practices, who could live where, who could travel. The ideas and practices of racial difference, which were developed in the colony over a century, traveled to England together with the slave owners and their human property. As the consumer demand for sugar expanded exponentially, and it became a necessity rather than a luxury, critical to the survival of the rapidly growing British proletariat, Jamaica was named as the jewel in the crown of Britain's empire. There was extensive coverage of the colony in the press, in pamphlet materials, and in fiction. The struggle over the abolition of the slave trade and then of slavery itself, all of which took over half a century, meant that Jamaica figured largely in the English imagination. It has remained the best known of what were once the British West Indian Islands. Now, of course, because of reggae and tourism and so on, but there's been a long history of all sorts of other things. When large numbers of West Indians started arriving in England in the 1950s, they were all assumed by the native population to be Jamaican, to the great annoyance of Barbadians, Antiguans, and so on. Samuel Long's great-grandson, Edward, was born in England, and as a third son, had expected a career in law. He was an enthusiastic writer as well, and had published a periodical and a novel. This is in the 1750s, we've got to now. His father, another Samuel, had been living in England, but was faced with terrible debts as a result of his father, Charles, having lost almost all of the family money in the South Sea bubble. Finding that the plantations, which had remained in the family's hands, were doing very badly under the care of an attorney, Samuel returned to Jamaica in the hope of recovering his fortune. This was a common pattern amongst the slave owners. When times were good, they returned to England, which they thought of as home, and they could live off the fruits of the labor of others. When crops failed or prices fell, they returned to Jamaica and ratcheted up the pressure on their laborers. In 1757, however, Samuel, Edward's father, died very suddenly. And when his will was read, Edward was found to have only a relatively meager inheritance. He was advised to go to Jamaica, where he could hope to make money. Jamaica was widely known as the place to make a fortune. Edward Long lived in Jamaica for 11 years. He made a speedy and very propitious marriage with Mary Ballard Beckford, accumulating some property and connecting himself to other elite slave-owning families. He borrowed money to acquire Lucky Valley from his older brother and turned it into a very successful enterprise. Over the 11 years, he bought land and enslaved people, introduced improvements, including the use of the plough, rebuilt the works, which were central to the production of sugar, improved the road, which was the route to the wharf at Old Harbour, constructed warehouses and offices at the port. Plantations were farms and factories, growing the cane and partially processing it, preparing it for the export to the mother country. The majority of the enslaved, including almost all the women, were field workers. The skilled artisans, the boilers, distillers, coopers, blacksmiths, were all men who looked after the works and formed the elite group amongst the Africans. The island was locked into the mercantilist system, producing for export, benefiting from the monopoly of sugar imports into Britain, tied to the use of British ships, protected by the British Army and Navy. By the time Edward Long left Jamaica, he had increased productivity more than threefold. A plantation that had produced at best 80 hogsheads of sugar was now producing over 300, with a greatly enlarged and highly organized labor force. He had also played a significant part in the governance of the colony. Shortly after his arrival, the major rebellion of 1760 had taken place, the most important slave rebellion of the 18th century. He was very well aware of the need for close surveillance and control over an African population which massively outnumbered the white population by roughly 10 to 1. And like his great-great-grandfather, he was an impassioned believer in the rights of freeborn Englishmen, a freedom which depended on the right to enslave others. This picturesque rendition of Lucky Valley was painted for the family, designed to hang on the walls of an English country house, fostering the notion of a benevolent system and minimalizing the Black presence. Edward Long returned to England in 1768, and he found a country that had changed. The slave trade, once accepted without question, apart from a very small number of Quakers and critics, sanctioned by Parliament and the Crown, was now under question. Granville Sharp, an early abolitionist, had taken up the cases of enslaved Africans who had been brought to England by their owners and managed to escape, only to be recaptured. Was it legal to hold slaves in England? James Somerset provided a test case in 1772. Chief Justice Lord Mansfield freed him while demarcating between England, a place that did not permit the kidnapping of Africans in order to re-enslave them, and the colonies, places where slavery was legitimate. Long and his fellow colonists were enraged. They had depended on the law to protect their ownership of human property. They began to look for other legitimations outside the law. The history of Jamaica, which Edward Long had been planning for some time, and which was published in 1774 in 3 volumes, established him as the authority on Jamaica, living in England. It's perhaps best described as a history of the present, a political, economic, social, and cultural representation of Jamaica in the 1760s. It tells us of the workings of racial capitalism in this particular mid-18th century Atlantic form, framed by a mercantilist system which structured the relation between metropole and colony. This was a system rooted in what was called the Guinea trade, the capture of Africans, and the utilization of their bodies, lives, and labor on Caribbean cane fields to produce sugar and rum for export to Britain. To Black women who labored in the fields and produced babies who belonged to the slave owner. Its mercantile base, the source of credit, which was crucial, was in London. Its plantation regime was shored up by a colonial state committed to fixing racial hierarchies. In these 3 volumes, Long describes the workings of government and the law, the organization of capital, the production and reproduction of an economy and society built on sugar and slavery, the plants that could be harnessed to commerce, the island's inhabitants designated as free and unfree, white and black, the landscape transformed in the interests of the production of wealth and the protection of white power. Long's aim was to convince his readers, and indeed himself, that racial hierarchy was natural, ordained by providence. No longer able to count on English law, he engaged with a range of Enlightenment thinkers on the nature of humankind and argued on the basis of his experience that the white and the Negro are two distinct species. It was a matter of the body and the mind. Africans, he argued, were essentially different from whites. Inequality was inevitable and necessary for a properly ordered society. Long's account of racial difference became one of the cornerstones of thinking about race in British society. My second moment. Slavery was finally abolished in the British Caribbean, Mauritius and the Cape in 1834, after, as I said, a 50-year struggle. This was only effected, as we have seen, by a deal being done with the slave owners and the payment of compensation. And at the same time, a period of apprenticeship was introduced of 4 to 6 years, during which the freed men and women had to continue working on the plantations for no pay. After a further campaign, this was abolished in 1838, the moment of what was recognized as full freedom in the Caribbean. The abolitionists had relied heavily on representations of enslaved Africans as victims, the famous Wedgwood image of the kneeling slave asking for help. Am I not a man and a brother? The emphasis was on the need of those enslaved to be rescued by their betters. Black agency was nowhere in sight, and nor was equality between white and black. This image was never uncontested. It competed with the representations of the pro-slavers of Africans as brutal, savage, bloodthirsty, and incapable of civilization. From the 1770s, when slavery became a subject of public debate in England, there was an ongoing argument as to the character of the person described as the African. Edward Long described captives in Africa as savages that could be partially civilized by slavery and the plantation. His successor as a historian of the West Indies, Brian Edwards, wrote a horrific account of the character of the rebels in Saint-Domingue, their sheer brutality. So abolitionists and pro-slavers were both representing stereotyped figures. There were significant numbers of Africans in London throughout this period, and their presence also became a matter of public concern and debate. Some were able to represent themselves, the best known, Equiano, whose autobiography told of his capture, journey to the Caribbean on the Middle Passage, how he was sold in Jamaica, how he got to America, his eventual escape from slavery. And that autobiography was very widely read in the 1790s and beyond. So different and conflicting accounts were circulating as to the nature of the African. But these sat alongside an assumption rooted in Enlightenment thinking over humankind that white people were, of course, at the top of the hierarchy. In the wake of emancipation, 2 Afro-Jamaicans came to England in 1840 and became well known amongst the abolitionist public. Edward Barrett and Henry Beckford, both of whom carried the names of slave owners, travelled to England with the Baptist missionary William Nibb to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. This was a huge event, a celebration of white male abolitionist success and a call to action across the globe. Britain had led the way and would now take the initiative in spreading benevolence elsewhere. White women had played a very important part in winning abolition, but this was highly contentious, and there was a heated debate at the convention over the attendance of women delegates from the US. They were finally accommodated behind a curtain. Similarly, the significance of Black agency to the ending of slavery was not recognized. It was in reality the major rebellion of 1831 in Jamaica that had finally convinced the metropolitan authorities that the system must be abolished. But there was silence over this. Over 400 delegates met in London for the Anti-Slavery Convention, and it was seen as a historic occasion suited to a great painting. And Benjamin Hayden's rendition of the convention now hangs in pride of place in the National Portrait Gallery, and both Barrett and Beckford figure in this portrait. They were to go around the country with William Nibb after the convention, speaking to nonconformist and abolitionist publics, representing all that was good about the emancipated. Edward Barrett carried the name of his owner. The Barrett family were a major English slave-owning family, and the first of them, the white ancestor of the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, had come to Jamaica, like Samuel Long, with the English army in 1655. Samuel Barrett established himself on the north coast of the island in the early 18th century and left a substantial property by the time of his death in 1760. His son Edward introduced many improvements on the plantations and built Cinnamon Hill, the family's great house. His two major plantations on the north coast of Jamaica were named Oxford and Cambridge. And that's the position of the Oxford and Cambridge estates. The curvy line you can see is the sea. So you can see that they're relatively close to the coast. And this is Cinnamon Hill, which has now become recognized as a historic tourist site in Jamaica. Edward Barrett needed wharves to unload the enslaved and to load the sugar and rum, which were to be shipped back to England. Falmouth was becoming an important port for bringing Africans to the north coast in the late 18th century. Edward, the fourth son of Samuel Barrett, made major contributions to developing the town of Falmouth, which still has the best surviving Georgian architecture on the island. It was laid out with a grid plan, a church for which he gave land, sporting a tall tower and marble monuments to planters and army officials. Anglican churches were for the white population. In 1815, the imposing Georgian courthouse was built, and by the 1820s, Falmouth was a fashionable seaport with 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants, broad streets, brick and timber houses, wharves for the imported goods from Britain and for the export of sugar and rum. There was a busy market selling goods which had been produced by the enslaved on their provision grounds, those grounds which were provided by the slave owners so that the enslaved could produce the majority of their own food, but which became very important in providing a sense of ownership and belonging. Falmouth also had shopkeepers, professionals, and 2 newspapers. That meant news from the metropole of anti-slavery activity could come in. The port facilitated news from other parts too. The sailors traveling across the Caribbean and beyond. There's a wonderful book which has been published recently by Julius Scott, which was written many years ago, called The Common Wind, which tells of the ways in which people heard about, the extraordinary ways in which people picked up the stories of revolt, rebellion, resistance, and hope and freedom. So here's Falmouth with the slave ships coming in. This is before emancipation. The Oxford and Cambridge plantations, and this is Falmouth a bit later, you can see the Georgian architecture. in those two. The Oxford and Cambridge plantations were not far from Falmouth. The abolitionists had hoped that the ending of the slave trade would bring significant improvements in the treatment of the enslaved, but this did not happen. As a way of putting pressure on the slave owners, they argued for a triennial census of all the men, women, and children on British plantations. This would both establish the figures on birth and mortality and whether the abolition of the slave trade had effectively ended new captives being brought in. The abolitionists made much use of these figures in their newspaper, The Anti-Slavery Reporter, as demonstrations of the short and harsh lives of the enslaved. These slave registers, as they are called, are an extraordinary archive, and they provide the basis for the next phase of our work at UCL, entitled Valuable Lives, Black Unfreedom and the Collapse of British Slavery. The registers variably include names, ages, Creole or African status, names of mothers, and in some instances, physical characteristics. This demographic data, when put together with other sources, will allow us to study naming practices, mobility across estates, family structures, and patterns of resistance. The hope is that we will be able to increase our understanding of the experience of enslaved people that's been so hard to document. We intend to create a new database, free public access, that in conjunction with our existing website will enable users to connect the slave owners, the estates, and the enslaved. The presentation in full of the names and available details of the persons listed will in itself advance the project of retrospective justice for some of the captives of British colonial society and speak directly to the needs of Black British communities and people. The slave register for 1817 includes a Creole man of 17 named Barrett on Oxford Plantation in the parish of Trelawney. His description as Creole means that he was born in Jamaica, though his mother would have been born in Africa. Henry Beckford, who travelled with Barrett, was a younger man, also Creole. His mother too had been born in Africa, and she had 2 other sons and a daughter. Henry had been moved from a plantation in Clarendon to St. Anne, Edward Barrett's retreat pen, an example of a local sale from one slave owner to another. So when there weren't new captives coming in, people bought across the colonies, which they weren't supposed to, and across the estates. The work on the pens, which was where the livestock were kept, was slightly less devastating than on the plantations. Hence, perhaps the name retreat pen, though often the sugar estates had the most inappropriate names, not least Lucky Valley. It was common for the enslaved to be given names by their owners, though they may have had African names too. It's possible to trace something of Barrett's history through his encounter with Baptist missionaries and the flourishing missionary and anti-slavery press. The arrival of nonconformist missionaries in Jamaica had greatly disturbed the planters. The missionaries focused their efforts on the enslaved, speaking to them directly in their communities and preaching that salvation was open to all. Abolitionist pressure in the metropole had led to a number of so-called ameliorative measures, which were meant to improve conditions on the plantations. And this included a right to religious teachings, something which the planters were greatly hostile to, since they saw this as encouraging dangerous notions of equality. One of the missionaries, a man called William Nibb, came to be baptized as a young adult and experienced the significant revival of abolitionism in the 1820s. He dreamed of a future in which he could become an instrument of Christ and minister to those he described as the swarthy sons of Africa. So there's a whole imaginative world to these missionaries. He was accepted as a missionary by the Baptist Missionary Society and went to Jamaica with his wife Mary in 1823. He was shocked at the cruelty of slavery, ashamed that I can belong to a race that can indulge in such atrocities. But it's very interesting that he uses the term race there for being English. He was making assumptions about his own level of civilization in relation to uneducated Africans. And he was disturbed by physical intimacies between Africans and his own family. So he did not want a black wet nurse for his child, given established beliefs about the linkage between breast milk and blood. Chapels built by the missionaries and their congregations became places for black people, an alternative space to the plantation, offering new possibilities of leadership and skills. They facilitated the establishment of networks of connection, which were crucial to the organization of resistance. The political consciousness of the enslaved was fed and watered by the mission churches and came to fruition in religious groups which they formed themselves under their leaders. Spiritual equality came to encompass political equality. Sam Sharp, who led the Great Rebellion of 1831 in Jamaica, was a deacon in a Baptist church in Montego Bay. But there were distinctions between the so-called Orthodox Baptists, led by the missionaries and following instructions from the Baptist Missionary Society, and the native Baptists or Black Baptists, who sought more autonomy and whose origins were in the congregations formed by Black Baptists who'd come from the United States in the wake of the American War. Black Baptists played an important part both in the rebellion of 1831 and the uprising at Morant Bay in 1865, which so disturbed the British public. The Great Rebellion of 1831, which was critical to the abolition of slavery, was about the creation of a new society in which Black people could be free. It lasted a week, there was much destruction of property, and it was followed by terrible reprisals against the rebels and vengeance against the missionaries who were blamed for the rebellion. The planters assumed that Black people could not have done this for themselves. The rebellion gathered support along the plantations of the North Coast. The Baptist missionaries begged their congregations not to engage in violence and the destruction of property, and some, including Edward Barrett, were loyal to their masters. Edward Barrett was named by William Nibb to the Select Committee on Slavery in 1831, the House of Lords, as one of those Baptists who had tried to defend his master's property. He was one of the 50 class leaders attached to William Nibb's church in Falmouth, and he was offered his freedom in return for his loyalty, but he refused it, saying that he would prefer for his son to be freed, for the bonds of slavery were much harder for the young. There is no evidence, however, that his son was manumitted. For William Nibb, Edward Barrett was the model of the new Black Christian subject that the missionaries hoped to see as the backbone of the new Jamaica. They envisaged an African version of a non-conformist English society. Freed men and women would lead responsible and industrious lives, led by the missionaries, focused on the chapel, going to their schools. They would live in proper families with proper relations between working men and dependent women who would care for home and family and children. The idea of the family was crucial to all this. They would break with the sexual promiscuity of a slave-owning society, the abuse of women, the impossibility, as the missionaries saw it, of Black manhood, the wickedness of white men. This trope of the family enabled abolitionists to encompass both similarity and difference. St. Paul was frequently quoted, "Neither Jew nor Greek, neither male nor female, ye are all one in Christ Jesus. All were equal in the sight of Christ." But the equality of souls did not mean that men and women were socially, economically, or politically equal. The idea of the universal family provided a language for this, a way of managing inequality and naturalizing power. Families were both places of belonging and sets of power relations, father to son, minister to member of the congregation, husband to wife, parents to children. Meanwhile, the luxurious life of the white Barrett family over generations, as with the Long family, carried on, financed by the enslaved. They had a grand house in Falmouth, which collapsed in the 1990s when there was little interest in Jamaican heritage, as well as Cinnamon Hill and the properties they had in England. The London house in Wimpole Street, which was a favoured residential area for West Indians, where both Edward Long and Brian Edwards lived at various times. In 1809, Edward Barrett bought Hope End in Herefordshire with West Indian money. The new house was built in Oriental style with minarets and greatly admired. In 1831, however, much damage was done to the plantations, and the mortgage he had was foreclosed. Hope End was sold. At the time of emancipation, Edward Barrett had the 2 plantations in Trelawney, plus a large pen for livestock retreat in St. Anne. And in compensation, he got over £12,500, with 224 enslaved persons on the Cambridge estate, 173 on the Oxford estate, 250 in the pen, all in our database. The slave owners had driven a hard bargain, but the compensation did not cover the labor they would have extracted from the enslaved over the rest of their lives. Hence, their complaints that it only covered a part of the value of what they saw as their property. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, despite her sympathy for the enslaved, some of you may know her famous poem, The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, saw emancipation as a financial disaster for her family, and it was her West Indian money that facilitated her escape from her patriarchal father to her lover, Robert Browning. In 1838, full freedom came with the abolition of apprenticeship. A great celebration was held on August the 1st in Falmouth, led by William Nibb. Edward Barrett, by now we can trace as the bookkeeper on the Oxford estate, earning £50 a year, which was a significant sum. Edward Barrett spoke at the celebration in Falmouth and then came to the anti-slavery convention with William Nibb. William Nibb introduced them to the great meeting. I beg to present, on behalf of 300,000 emancipated slaves in the island of Jamaica, the only tribute which they have to give, but which I am sure is the best tribute they could give, namely the propriety of their conduct since they have been made men, free men, rising in intelligence and exhibiting to the world that propriety of conduct which has won the emancipated sons and daughters of Africa universal admiration. And Beckford and Barrett both responded. So Barrett, while the planters during the time of slavery compelled their children and wives to work in the fields from morning to night, they now sent their children to school and allowed their wives to fill the station for which they were intended, that of attending to their families and homes. Both men were telling the story the missionaries wanted the British public to hear: African gratitude for the gift of freedom and the social transformations that had taken place, from the sexual depravity and promiscuity of the slave owners with their innumerable illegitimate children to domesticity and family. Sadly, that did not end with emancipation, and the planters were extremely successful in the period after emancipation of continuing to exploit labor, limit the black franchise, and maintain white power. So in Hayden's painting, this is Thomas Clarkson, the Venerable Thomas Clarkson, father of abolition, addressing the people. You can just about see the ladies at the back behind with their bonnets. And this is Henry Beckford at the front with a direct line of vision to Thomas Clarkson. And Benjamin Hayden, the painter, insisted on placing Beckford there because he wanted him in the center of the picture. As he later told Clarkson, he wanted to place the African in the front of the picture on the same level as the Europeans. You can't actually see Edward Barrett. He's one of the many faces. But there were issues over his placing, even with staunch abolitionists. Should he really be there in the center of the painting? And while all the white delegates in the painting are named, there's a whole listing of all their names. Barrett and Beckford were simply described as emancipated slaves. Slave owners such as Edward Long believed that black and white would never be equal, that black people were essentially different, a matter of skin, body, and mind. Abolitionists believed in equality between black and white in the future when they were fully civilized and had become like us. But who could say when that would be? Both these understandings of racial difference live on in the present. There are no simple binaries, and it's worth remembering these complexities. There were Orthodox Baptists and Black Baptists, rebels and loyalists. There were pro-slavers, abolitionists, and radical abolitionists, all discussing race and taking somewhat different positions. So the complexity of racial thought is what I want to bring your attention to, which is just as true for the present as it was in the past. But it's also vital to remember the wealth and the notions of racial difference that flowed from Jamaica to Britain in the period of colonialism and beyond, and remind ourselves of the unpaid debt and the need for reparation. Thank you very much.